Lie to Diep. Hello everyone, wishing you all good health and peace in life. There are moments when a shock runs so deep, it numbs the mind, and in that silence, names fade. To Diep forgot James, but can the heart truly forget what it once loved? Even when the mind turns away, does the heart still whisper his name? The rain poured like silver needles from the heavens, blurring the streets, the faces, and even memories. Somewhere in a small, unfamiliar village, a young woman sat by a window, her fingers tracing invisible lines on the glass. Her name was Diep, though even that sounded foreign to her now. Her memories were fragments, pieces of a puzzle scattered far from reach. She remembered falling, running, fear, and then darkness. But nothing more. What she didn't remember was James. James, the man who had once held her hand when the world turned cold. The man who had risked everything to find her when she disappeared. The man whose voice once made her heart flutter. It had all vanished like smoke and wind. The doctor said the shock had been too much. Trauma-induced amnesia, he called it. But what he didn't explain, what science couldn't grasp, was the ache she sometimes felt in her chest when the night grew quiet. A soft, pulling emptiness, as if someone important was missing, but she couldn't say who. Meanwhile, James was breaking. He had searched through cities, through forests, even through whispers of rumors. He had begged the police, hired private investigators, and followed every trace like a madman. And when they told him they had rescued a woman matching to Diep's description, but didn't inform him because she couldn't remember anything, his knees gave out. Not from anger, not from exhaustion. From heartbreak. I don't care if she doesn't remember me, he whispered. I'll remind her, even if it takes forever. Back in the village, Diep walked slowly through a garden behind the house that had sheltered her since she was found. She stopped by a tree she didn't recognize, yet it felt strangely familiar. Her fingers brushed the bark and her heart skipped. A flash, a man, holding her hand. Under a tree like this, laughing, she gasped, and it was gone. One morning, as the sun stretched gold across the hills, a stranger arrived in the village. He had tired eyes and a trembling voice. When the old woman who'd cared for Diep pointed to the garden, he rushed there without hesitation. And there she was, watering the flowers, humming a tune she didn't remember learning. Diep, he said. She turned, looked at him, confused, then polite. I'm sorry, do I know you? James didn't cry. He smiled. A sad, broken smile. No, he said, but I know you, and I think maybe your heart might still remember. She stared at him. There was something in his voice like a melody just beyond memory. Something familiar, warm. And for a moment, her hand trembled. Because sometimes, even when the mind forgets, the heart remembers. When the heart whispers louder than the mind. Diep stood frozen, eyes locked with James. His face stirred something inside her, not quite memory, but a feeling. A flicker, like standing at the edge of a forgotten dream. James didn't move closer. He feared overwhelming her, feared shattering this delicate moment. I know you don't remember me, he said softly, but I remember everything for the both of us. Diep looked down at her hands, as if trying to find answers in her own skin. I don't know why, but your voice. It feels like home. That doesn't make sense, does it? It makes perfect sense, he replied. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with untold stories, with shared moments lost to time. He sat on the bench beneath the tree, just as they used to. Slowly, hesitantly, she joined him. James pulled something from his pocket, a small, worn photo. It showed her, smiling with messy hair, standing next to him in a field of wildflowers. She looked at it for a long time, her fingers brushing its edge. I feel like I know this person, she whispered. But why can't I see it clearly? Because the mind protects us when it thinks we're not ready, he said gently. But the heart never forgets. Over the next few days, James didn't push her. He didn't beg her to remember or try to make her relive the past. Instead, he simply stayed. He helped in the garden. He told her stories, some true, some playful, all gentle. He laughed with her, listened when she spoke, and let her rediscover herself in her own time. And Diep felt it, that quiet warmth inside her growing stronger with every moment they shared. Then one evening, as the stars blinked awake in the velvet sky, she sat beside him and said, "James, can I ask you something, anything? Do you think I'll ever remember you?" He looked up at the sky, his voice steady but tender. "Maybe, maybe not. But even if your memories never return, I'll build new ones with you. I'll love you all over again if I have to." Her eyes shimmered. "Then maybe I don't need to remember everything. Maybe I just need to trust what I feel when I'm with you." He smiled. "What do you feel right now?" Diep reached out, hesitantly, then placed her hand in his. "Peace, like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. Because even when memories are erased, true love finds its way back, not through the mind, but through the heart." A memory like rain, the days grew quieter, softer. Diep found herself humming old melodies while watering the plants, or glancing over at James and wondering why his smile made her chest tighten with a strange ache, like missing something she never knew she had. One late afternoon, as a summer storm rolled in, the sky cracked open and rain poured down. James rushed out to bring in the laundry. Diep followed instinctively, helping him gather shirts and towels as they both laughed, soaked and breathless. Then it happened. She slipped slightly in the mud, and James caught her by the waist, steadying her, holding her close for a second too long. The smell of rain, the warmth of his hands, the exact way his eyes searched hers. And suddenly, like a door creaking open in her mind, it came rushing back. The hill where they once danced in the rain. The night he whispered, "You're my home," while holding her tightly. The morning she kissed him without saying a word, because love didn't need one. She gasped and stepped back, clutching her head. I remember." James froze. "What did you say?" "I remember you," she said, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "You carried me through my worst nights. You stayed even when I pushed you away. You loved me before I even knew how to love myself." James's throat tightened, but he nodded, swallowing emotion. "I still do." She ran into his arms then, not with confusion or hesitation, but with certainty, the kind that only lives in those who have been lost and finally found. The rain washed over them, but neither moved. They stood wrapped in each other, in the past and the present and whatever future was waiting. Because sometimes it takes forgetting everything to truly understand what matters. And when the heart remembers, no storm can keep love apart. The shadow that waited, the reunion was sweet, but peace did not last long. Just days after Diep remembered everything, James received an anonymous note slid under his door. The paper was wet, the ink smeared, but the words were clear enough. "She knows too much. If you want to keep her safe, walk away." James's face hardened. Diep, now fully aware of her past, saw the name and froze. "John," she whispered. "He was the one. The one who caused the fire. The one who tried to silence me." James nodded grimly. "He thinks we're weak now. He doesn't know who he's dealing with." Diep stepped forward. "We have to stop him, for good." But James looked at her with the weight of love and fear. "Not we, me. I've protected you this far. I won't let you walk back into danger." She took his hand, calm and certain. "You didn't fall in love with a fragile girl. You fell in love with a fighter. Let me fight for us too." That night, they packed their things quietly. Diep wrote a note for the kind old woman who had sheltered her, thanking her and leaving behind the necklace she once wore before the accident, a symbol of her past now reclaimed. Together, James and Diep returned to the city. The darkness was thicker there. Old memories felt like fog in narrow alleys. But Diep was no longer running. She was returning, with purpose. John wasn't hiding. He was waiting, in a glass building lit with greed and secrets. He smiled coldly when he saw them arrive. "Well, well," he said slowly, standing from his leather chair. "The girl remembers, and the boy still plays hero." Diep stepped forward before James could say anything. "You tried to erase me. You failed. I remember everything, and soon, the world will too." James placed a recorder on the table. Click. John's smile faltered. "This time," James said softly, "we came prepared." Truth on record. The room fell into a heavy silence as the soft click of the recorder echoed. John's cold eyes darted to the device. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Diep stood firm, her voice steady. "You confessed everything at the hospital when James was pretending to be unconscious," she said. "You thought no one was listening, but we were." James nodded, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were photos, financial records, and voice recordings, evidence of John's betrayal, the burned files, the embezzled funds, and the threats against Diep. John forced a laugh. "You think this is enough to stop me? You forget who I am. I have friends in higher places than you can imagine." James leaned in, calm but intense. "And you forget that people are tired of being afraid of you." Suddenly, the door opened. A group of officers stepped in, led by the detective who once helped James secretly gather evidence. Behind them was the district attorney and a small press crew. John paled. "This is being recorded live," the officer said. "We have enough to open a full investigation. You're under arrest for fraud, arson, and attempted murder." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, John looked at Diep one last time. "You think this changes anything?" She looked him straight in the eye. "It already has." A quiet morning. Weeks passed. The court case moved forward with public support. John's empire began to crumble as whistleblowers came forward, inspired by Diep's courage. One early morning, Diep sat on the porch of their quiet countryside home, sipping tea. James joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You're quiet today," he said gently. "I was thinking about how strange life is," she whispered. "That losing my memory helped me remember who I really am." James took her hand. "And who is that?" She smiled. "Someone who is no longer afraid. Someone who knows how deeply she can love and be loved." The wind brushed softly through the trees. The chaos was behind them. The future was unwritten, but this time, they would write it together. Life lesson. The heart remembers what the mind forgets. Sometimes life pushes us to the edge, into pain, betrayal, or even memory loss. Diep forgot everything, her past, her name, even the man she once loved. But what she could not forget was the feeling of love itself. Deep within her heart, a quiet truth remained. This story teaches us that even when the mind is clouded, the heart holds on. Memories may fade, but the emotions we build through kindness, trust, and sacrifice are not so easily erased. True love isn't just remembered with the mind, it is lived, felt, and known through every moment of care and protection. James never gave up on Diep, even when she had forgotten him. His patience, gentleness, and belief in her helped her slowly find her way back. That reminds us, real love waits, real love fights, and real love heals. Most importantly, this story teaches us that identity isn't only shaped by the past, but also by the choices we make when we are lost. In the end, Diep chose to be brave, and in doing so, she found not only her memory, but her strength,